Hello, I'm Gillian Petrakovsky from Oxford Systematic Reviews, where I'm a founding partner, and also from the University of Oxford's Long-Term Ecology Lab, led by Professor Cathy Willis, where I'm a research associate. I'm very pleased to have been invited to participate in webinar 3 of this series, focusing on the impacts of biomass use on biodiversity. So at OxRev, we specialise in systematic evidence evaluations and training for evidence evaluations. Please do have a look at the website for more information on what we do and why we do it. But just to say that we've worked on a number of systematic maps in OxRev and also in the Oxford Long-Term Ecology Lab, where we in fact first developed some of the techniques that I'm going to show you. My talk will cover the main sections of our recent research, which has just been accepted for publication in Forest Ecology and Management. The illustration on the right here just shows the number of studies we included in our evidence evaluation in each state, together with the number and type of wood pellet production facilities in each state. Brief background, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. Burning biomass has been promoted as a renewable energy alternative to coal and gas, leading to a large global increase in demand and production of biofuel. An important component of this biofuel production is wood pellets from the Southeast USA. Wood pellet companies are expanding their operations, with almost 1 million tonnes of processing capacity either planned or under construction. The industry claims to use wood from two main sources: forest plantations, where the wood is grown in rotation as a sustainable crop, and woody byproduct of otherwise unused or unvalued material from timber harvests. These claims are contested by some conservation groups who report that the industry threatens valued forest, including old-growth forest, and ecosystems of the southeast. That's really the setting for the review that we undertook to investigate some of these claims and counterclaims. There's no official US government definition of the Southeast region, but I'm sure you're all familiar with this geographical area, and the map here shows the forest land cover of the 4 main types of forested land recognised by Homer et al. In their National Land Cover database. And this is the area of interest to our current work. So in order to assess the body of scientific evidence on the effects of biodiversity of forest operations for biofuel in the Southeast region, a systematic evidence evaluation was undertaken to record all research reporting effects on plants, animals and fungi of various forestry practices that were either directly applicable to the claims of the wood pellet industry in terms of material extracted, or potentially of relevance to a broader discussion about effects of extractions from these forests on biodiversity. We set out our review questions as a primary question: what are the impacts of the wood pellet industry on biodiversity in the southeastern USA? And a couple of secondary questions which we examined along the way. So why a systematic evidence evaluation? Well, a systematic evidence evaluation, you've often heard of this perhaps called systematic reviews. They're one type of an evidence evaluation. It's a rigorous and transparent methodology to assess the impacts of some kind of human activity and the effectiveness of policy or management interventions on environments. The rigour and transparency applied at each stage of the process does differentiate them from the majority of traditional literature reviews. And in essence, it's a process of filtering a huge number of potentially relevant studies into a reduced number of studies that are highly relevant and meet the criteria for the review. And all of this done in a transparent, repeatable and peer-reviewed fashion. So having developed research questions, the first step is to develop a good search strategy to search widely for relevant studies in the peer-reviewed and grey literature. And this slide shows the various places that we looked for our evidence. I don't intend to go through it in detail, can happily answer questions on it later. The systematic screening process filtered almost 20,000 research articles retrieved from the bibliographic databases and the grey literature in a stepwise process that resulted finally in a set of 211 studies dating from 1990 to 2020. We used a machine learning tool to screen the papers called Colander, which increases the efficiency of screening and vastly speeds up the process, which is one of the exciting things about using artificial intelligence and machine learning to support systematic reviews. In addition to the written scientific paper, an important output of this review was an interactive evidence map which we produced. This is freely available for users, and you can explore through this map subsets of the entire evidence base which we put together according to your own criteria. The web link for the interactive map is there on the bottom of the slide, and I do urge you to go and explore it at your leisure. The way this works is, for example, the highlighted cluster of studies which I've shown here can be expanded to the constituent studies which make up that cluster in the region. And these are color-coded according to various criteria which you can see as filter points on the interactive map. In this case, the different colors show the different biodiversity taxa which we looked at, and each of these points on the map is linked to a data sheet showing you what the primary evidence was that's gone into the evidence map. I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. So in terms of what we found through looking at the evidence collected, the 211 odd papers, 80% of the evidence comes from journal articles, not surprisingly, although 17% was from non-journal sources, mostly reports from the US Forest Service research stations. This is a higher proportion of so-called grey literature than many systematic reviews. Publications represented by 3 or more articles in the evidence map are dominated by 2 publications, as you can see, Forest Ecology and Management Journal, in fact this paper is going to be published in, and GenTech reports from the Southern Research Station of the US Forest Service. The graph on the right shows you the spread by year from 1990 to 2020, with several peaks which probably relate to conferences that were either held in that year or the year before, so spikes in the evidence base. This just shows you one type of research result we can look at, where we divided the evidence base by forest management intervention. And most studies reported multiple forest and silvicultural management strategies, some of which acted as comparators for each other, and others of which were tested against baseline data. Studies varied widely in time since the management intervention and duration of study, from immediately after the intervention to 80 years afterwards, and I'll say a little more about that later. So biodiversity was measured by abundance in 81 studies, by richness in 28 studies, and by both abundance and richness in 94 studies. 8 studies didn't specify what type of measurement they were undertaking. A range of experimental methods was used to measure or capture biodiversity, as you can see on the left, and taxonomic groups represented in the evidence base are shown in the table on the right-hand side. The complete lack of studies reporting impacts of forest management interventions on fungi is a very disappointing finding, as is the balance between studies reporting animals and plants, excluding trees. Almost as many studies reported on birds alone as reported on plants, and this appears to represent a very much understudied group within forestry and an evidence gap that could be further researched. A minority of studies reporting negative impacts to biodiversity are largely from studies that are less than 5 years in duration. So this graph here, this violin plot here, shows whilst an initial negative impact might be reported in the literature, the longer-term implications to biodiversity are not reported in the evidence base in studies of, for example, more than 30 years duration. The evidence base appears to show instances of biodiversity recovering shortly after disturbances caused by management practices, which highlights the potential resilience of these forests to active management. And this is further supported by the comparison of negative impacts to biodiversity against time since intervention. So when a longer time period since the intervention was applied, we get fewer negative impacts to biodiversity reported, especially amongst land invertebrates, amphibians, mammals, and vascular plants. And again, this is one of the findings of our evidence base that show that the literature is dominated by short-term studies undertaken shortly after the forestry activity in question. And that's something that we might like to discuss later. Almost 1/3 of the studies in the evidence map showed some type of negative effect on biodiversity. These included studies which did not specify that extractions or harvesting were for bioenergy specifically, but the wider forestry operations that we investigated in our evidence map. Of the 44 studies which reported biodiversity effects of extraction specifically for fuel use or removal of deadwood or slash, 18 studies only recorded harmful effects on biodiversity, and this represents just 9% of the whole evidence base, which we thought was a pretty interesting finding. We undertook a canonical correlation analysis, CCA, which is just a statistical way of measuring the linear relationship between any two multidimensional variables. And the results from the CCA explain 10.5% of variation within our data set and indicate that there are only 3 statistically significant forest management practices which correspond with any sort of negative impact on biodiversity, and those are woody residue removal, shelterwood systems, and thinning. So amongst these minority of studies reporting any sort of negative impact on biodiversity at all, a very complicated picture emerged of different forestry practices impacting on different taxa in different ways and to different extents, as you might imagine. For example, amphibians were mostly impacted by clear cutting and riparian zone activity and shelterwood management practices. But it has to be said that all these papers related only to salamanders. Birds were most negatively impacted by the management practice of clear cutting. But these negative impacts were only recorded within the clear-cut areas themselves. When studies looked at bird abundance and diversity in adjacent forest plots, no negative impacts were found. Land invertebrates were found to have been, in our evidence base, the most negatively affected group, accounting for 26% of all the negative impacts in our evidence base. They were impacted by a wider range of forestry management practices, as we might expect. And aquatic invertebrates appear to have been most negatively affected by clear cutting. Mammals most negatively impacted by woody residues removal and controlled burning. Not surprisingly, perhaps trees and vascular plants were mostly affected by clear cutting, selection systems, and shelterwood methods. So just to touch on how you might use the interactive evidence map to explore the results in our research, which I showed you earlier briefly. For example, you can filter out 2 of the taxonomic groups, amphibians and invertebrates, to produce a subset of the data shown here on the left in blue and grey circles to explore those data points in the map. Another filter that you can put in place is to perhaps focus only on the 31% of all studies that showed any negative impact by selecting the yes, filter by negative impact, and you get a subset of studies shown here on the left. And further filtering are these negative effect studies, but this time looking at time since intervention, the violin plots that I showed you earlier. You can see that the majority of studies are less than 5 years after forestry intervention. The full set of negative studies, 78 data points. If you time slice it to 5 years or more since intervention, you get right the way down to 26 data points. If you continue this process to slice by time since intervention to say 13 or 14 years after the forestry practice, which is reasonable forestry time duration, there are only 4 data points. And if you click on that data point that we just saw circled, you can pull up the data sheet that appears on the interactive map. And these are the data sheets which were compiled for all 211 studies in the evidence map. There's obviously a lot more you can do to interact with the results of the evidence evaluation through the map, but this is better done by exploring the map on your own, and I've put the link there at the bottom of the slide for you to follow at your level. So a few key findings from this fairly wide-ranging systematic evidence evaluation that we undertook. And the key take-home points, I suppose, are that of the 211 studies which we identified as being highly relevant to the research topic from an analysis of nearly 20,000 articles which looked potentially interesting, 69% of these studies showed no negative impacts of forestry practices on biodiversity. Of the 31% of studies that did report some negative impacts, we could say in summary that land invertebrates were most frequently affected by management practices including woody residues removal and shelter wood. Birds were impacted by clear cutting, controlled burning and pruning, and mammals were impacted by controlled burning and removal of woody residues. No studies reported negative impacts on reptiles. Thank you to all the many people who helped with this review, and I'd be very happy to take questions in the course of this webinar. Thank you very much.